I'm going to talk through, as he said, look at formulas in a little more detail. As a talk I've given a couple times before, but I'm happy to, interested in how you guys take it, and especially coming from an Access background. I'm going to go through a little bit, just a table of how PowerApps relates to Access and how to think about the corollaries between them. Go through an introduction of how we think about PowerApps differently than we do other systems. In particular, we're not an imperative language. It has imperative shades, but largely it's a declarative model with data flow very consistent with Excel. And then working with data, that introduction will be more academic, but then we want to get into the details of how you actually get data in and out of PowerApps and work with data like you would in an Access app. And then if we have time, there's some more advanced topics I can go through about how we do iteration and how we use patch to update things, et cetera, et cetera. And feel free to interject best to answer them. So I want to talk about first just laying out the map of how Access and Access Web Apps relate to PowerApps. They are very different animals. They do try to address similar problems. Let's start at the top. The apps that you author in the Access world, it was all done in a Windows rich app. In PowerApps, you can do it with a rich Windows app, which is a Windows 8 app, a modern app that also runs on Windows 10. Or you can use the web, and the web is actually far more popular for our users than the Windows app. It is exactly the same experience. The entire authoring and runtime experience within PowerApps is based on HTML and JavaScript. So it didn't take us, I shouldn't say it take a lot of effort, but it was a lot of effort. But moving the Windows app to the web wasn't so hard, and it is the same code base between them. So the experience is largely the same. There's a few differences. Access to hardware is a little harder if you're on a web page as opposed to running through a rich app, where you can get at things like the camera and the microphone more readily than you can through HTML. But otherwise, it is the same experience, and you will sometimes get a better performance experience if you're using a fast JavaScript engine like it comes in Chrome as opposed to using Edge or IE. The apps that you create in the old Access world, it was based on Windows, and Access Web Apps that was just based on the web. In this world, we can run in a rich Windows app, we can run on the web in a web page, and we can run on mobile devices, tablets, phones, based on iOS, Android, and Windows Phone. We are also looking at embedding in various places. One of the places we'll do that and make it part of the SharePoint experience. And we have some of that today, but we'll have a deeper integration when we get to Ignite that we'll be showing, or not Ignite, Ignite. They'll be showing in late September. The data stored in Access Desktop, obviously an ActDB or an MBB file. In Access Web Apps, it went to SQL Azure. In PowerApps, we don't have any of our own storage. The closest thing we come to our own storage is the Common Data Service, which is a companion product that we work very closely with. And you'll see more and more alignment between us and CDS to make it a seamless experience between the two. But largely, you can put your data wherever you want, and people tend to put in SharePoint, put in SQL. You can even use Excel or Salesforce or any number of other places. We are agnostic with respect to that and use a connector model to get all that information. I specifically call it tabular connectors. There's a set of our connectors that are tabular, that understand tables and allow you to do reads and writes and put information in and out based on a table metaphor, as opposed to a service like talking to Twitter, where it's not a table, instead you're just calling methods that do the work for you. And those are useful as well, but we don't integrate those in a tabular way the way we do the 5 that I listed, or the 4 I listed here are the main ones that we interact with and are making a good experience. Access Web stuff, Access Desktop ran offline, Access Web Apps didn't. We can to a small degree. It's very basic support, but you can launch your app offline on a phone. You can do manual data management, but it's not automatic. Where we'd like to go is a world in which it's like Outlook cached mode against Exchange, where the data is just ambiently updated and it's available. You don't have to think about going offline and all that. But we're not there yet. So right now there's a way to do it, but it does require a bit of manual intervention. Access Desktop had absolute position forms. Access Web Apps had the snap to grid. It was absolute position, but you were limited to where you could put things, and it was non-overlapping. One of the strengths of PowerApps is that you can make screens that look exactly the way you want. With absolute position, Z-ordered, alpha blended, screen time distance, we're trying to come up with a great experience that a mobile user would go, yeah, that's a great mobile app. I expect that kind of interaction and visuals that you would get from a nice mobile app, that's the kind of thing we want to be able to produce in PowerApps. There's a lot of emphasis on making it visually very appealing and having a WYSIWYG experience for creating that. Media, largely images on the Access side. In PowerApps, we do have video and audio, and we try to use the capabilities of the device as much as we can, which gets that next line as well. The GPS, the camera, the microphone, the accelerometers, those are all available to you as properties that are data that you can use within your app to track where you are, to put your dot on a map, etc. To take a rich advantage of the fact that you have these great sensors in mobile devices. Queries, SQL-based in the Access world. Access web apps use that same query builder, but we didn't expose the SQL language directly. In PowerApps, there's a formula language. It's not SQL. So this is more akin to what you would expect from Excel, and Excel is our inspiration for a lot of what we do. There are functions for doing filtering and sorting and grouping that effectively create queries. They do queries based on those composing of those functions together. But it's not a T-SQL-like language at all. It's not a select star from blah. It is very much its own thing and modeled after Excel. You can't do everything you can do in a regular query either. There's no joins in PowerApps right now. Not that we don't want them, but we are working, our protocol we use for connectors is based on OData, and OData does not currently support joins. So we can't even express a join to the back end at the moment. We're dependent on the back end doing that join. And so we're working towards making it possible to call a stored procedure or a query that's got that join baked into it and using that directly from PowerApps. But PowerApps right at the moment, even simple things like that aren't available. It is first early days with respect to what we can do with queries in that manner. Relationship aware, Access very much so. PowerApps not so much. If you want to do a lookup between two tables, you can, but you have to do it pretty manually using a lookup function and add columns and composing it yourself. It's not really relationship aware. This is one of the areas that we're spending a lot of time on right now, and we'll have more to say about this, I hope, at Ignite, and some exciting stuff we can show you there. But right at the moment, it's not going to just know that this is a lookup and a one-to-many relationship and just do the right thing in all cases for you. In some cases it will, for a map from data. Using metadata, it can be a little aware, but in the overall experience, it's not very relational aware, but that is something we're working on. External data, very little in Access web apps, of course, a whole bunch in Access desktop based on ODBC and the older world. In our world, we have this rich set of connectors, and I talked about some already, but there is Facebook and Twitter and MySQL, and there a whole bunch of them. There's a whole bunch more coming. We have an entire team that's working on these connectors, and it's the same team that does the Power BI connectors. So there's consistency there, and there's a lot of emphasis put on connectors. There's a lot coming there, and as people demand more connectors, or talking to systems we haven't already gone to, but we'll add them. It also has the ability to talk to custom REST APIs. You can create your own connector, and a lot of people do that if they're doing fancy stuff in SQL, for which they need to have a set of methods specifically tailored to their application. It's totally possible you can write your own custom REST APIs and add those as a connector and then take advantage of them from PowerApps. The UI logic, we had UI macros and VBA in the past. There are formula language stuff that I'll be going through today. There are imperative events like onSelect that you can tap into to make it do things. On data logic, VBA and data macros could have been used for that in the past. We don't have anything like that in PowerApps because we don't own our storage. Anything that's going to be done with respect to data logic is going to have to come from SQL or from the Common Data Service or from some place that owns the data, so that you can write a trigger or a wrapper method that controls access to that data in a choke point, so you can only get to that data through that pipe. So it's not a thing for PowerApps. We need to do a good job of integrating whatever we find in that backend store, and things like validation and default rules, that stuff needs to come through and be visible to us. But in general, we're not going to be the ones enforcing data logic and authoring data logic. It's going to have to be at the back end. And then we still hear the last line about admin. One of the key points of PowerApps is that it's really easy to administer. It's really easy for an IT admin to get in there and see the connectors that are being used and to cut those off if they're inappropriate, or if there's been a security breach or whatever. They can see all the apps that are being used. We're working on analytics so that the admin and the user can see how their app is being used, by whom, for what purpose, all that stuff. So it's controllable. What we still hear a great deal at Microsoft is that access desktop apps that are based on MacDB files. They're just strewn throughout organizations. Nobody has any control over them. Nobody knows what's in them. We're trying to address that problem, and PowerApps does a really good job there. So that's the introduction of PowerApps and its juxtaposition to Access desktop and web apps. Are there any specific questions before I move on? I'm going to take that as a no. I'm going to move on. I need you to take 2 words away from this presentation, more than anything else. Please think like Excel. Please, please, please think like Excel. I get questions all the time about how I do things in a manner similar to how it would have been done in VBA, where it was an imperative language, how I would write an event handler. And although there are event handlers in PowerApps, that's not the primary way things get done. In particular, you can't just set a property to a value. The property has to have a formula that pulls in that value. And so it's a different way of thinking about the programming, and the jury's still out if this is more approachable for people that are not professional developers. We think it is. We think this will allow us to go after more Office users and folks that otherwise have not seen programming in the past. But for you folks that have seen programming in the past, it will seem a little awkward at first, but you do get used to it, and it is quite powerful and makes debugging way easier than you would have to do with an imperative language. So there are 2 kinds of language in the world. There's imperative logic, like we all know and love, where you define steps 1, 2, 3, and you push changes out. You set properties. It's very event-driven. And that stuff is, the event happens, is executed once for each event. This is the programming model that we all know and love forever. Declarative logic, we're calling it, and declarative is a very loaded term, and even within Microsoft, we try to avoid using it too much. The idea, declarative, all it really means is that we're not saying when things happen, that instead it's describing a relationship between 2 things, and how and when it happens, that's up to the system to decide. And this is very much like Excel. You define data flow dependencies between values. And instead of pushing a property value, you pull changes to that value. And so logic is automatically performed. Essentially, the app is recalcing all the time. As values are changing, as the user is typing in a value, that value is flowing through the graph. And wherever it has an impact, has a dependency, that's where the update will happen. And so the example I have here is a button on click setting the screen background color. In the imperative world, the button on click would cause the background color to change. And it would do it right then, and it would do it once. In the bottom version, instead, there's a relationship drawn between the background color and what it's going to be set to. And it's based on the name being blank or not. But I don't have to imperatively say, on the button change, go reset the background color. I don't have to worry about ensuring that all the updates happen in my app. All I need to do is define this relationship, and the right thing will happen all the time. And this is the only way that you can do properties in PowerApps. You cannot walk up to the background color of a screen and just whack it with a new color. It has to be described in a manner like this. Now, some of the advantages of this is that if you want to understand what is manipulating the background color, what may have caused the background color to change to red or black or yellow or some other thing, all you have to do is go look at that formula. That formula will describe it in its entirety. There is no other way the background color will change except through this formula. In the imperative world, the problem with it is you could have 5 different entry points, all of which change the background color. And maybe one of those ran and you didn't expect it to run in a way that you didn't expect. You have to backtrack and find all those places and figure out which one was the one that went astray. That doesn't have to happen in the declarative world. So we type constraints on how you update things so it's easier to walk that graph and so that your app becomes a set of these small pieces of logic. Formulas govern everything that happens. There are lots of these little pieces of code. There are no large monolithic procedures. Now, some of our formulas can get quite large, and I'll show you some examples of that. But only one path determines that value. And that formula language is modeled after Excel for familiarity as much as we possibly can. Every time we add something, we're always like, what does Excel do? What would Excel do? We actually talk to the Excel team quite often about, well, we want to add this thing. We know you guys aren't going to do it necessarily, but if you did, would you do it this way, or would you do it some other way? And have that discussion to try to make it as consistent with Excel as possible. Again, to try to draw in more Office users who wouldn't necessarily know how to do programming to this world. Let's see. Controls. Formulas are defined for the properties of the controls. So the formulas, each control has a whole set of properties. Controls and their properties are at the global scope. They can be referenced from anywhere. Screens themselves are containers for controls, and the screen itself is a control with its own properties and formulas. But the formulas I've been talking about, they are all associated with a control one way or another. So let me give you an example. I've got 3 slider controls, which is these guys here. And I can dial up or down, and this top one is controlling red, this one's controlling green, this one's controlling blue. So I'm dialing in a color. Very simple app. Now, in traditional programming, you would have said, okay, on change for this guy, go run some code. And on change for this guy, go run some code. And if you were fancy, you might have actually created a subroutine that on change for any of them, you would call, and then it would read all 3, and it would adjust the RGB for the background. In our world, we don't have to do that. So in our world, the fact that this moves, there's nothing to write on the slider. Instead, what I do is I go to the background of the screen, and I say that its color is based on RGB A for alpha blend of slider 1's value, slider 2's value, and slider 3's value. Saying that's all I need to say. And now as I just slide this around, the right thing happens. And this formula is reevaluated in real time as the slider is adjusted. You also notice I'm actually in PowerApps right now at authoring time. I can actually interact with the app while I'm authoring it. So I can select the control, but I can also move its value, and the thing is recalculating. PowerApps is live all the time. Again, similar to Excel. In Excel, you don't go into an authoring mode to go write formulas between cells. You just go write formulas, and they're just calculating all the time, and they're just showing you the most live data all the time. Same is true for PowerApps. If I move this thing around, it's just going to update accordingly. These guys, these labels over here, they're just showing the values. So it's another element to this that I could add on, and I could remove this if I wanted to, and it wouldn't impact the color that's happening in the background. And so let me give you another example. When I get these things to be pretty dark, if I pull these values down, then you can't see these values anymore. They're too dark as well. So to fix that, we can go set the color value. We can say, we give this a formula. So we can say the color if slider 1, and we give you IntelliSense with color coding to try to help you find the right thing. If that's less than 10, let's make it less than 20, then use white. And there's a set of colors that are automatically baked in, but you can put an RGB value here as well, or make it black. And it's not less than 20. Now it's less than 20. So this value, that color property I just defined, now it's setting this to white just because the slider is in this particular range. So it's very simple to do conditional formatting, and not just the color, but the font size, all aspects of the program, all aspects of this label. There's a rich set of properties that I can set based on some formula. Like the hover color I could change based on the value, or should it be italic or not, could be based on a value. All these guys can have formulas that tie them in to what's going on in the rest of the app, the rest of the state for the app that's going on. So this is also model of Excel apps, obviously. There's a set of properties, there's a formula that I can write here, there's a formula picker to help you find the functions. There's a rich set of functions, most of which come from Excel, but there's some that are specific to us that you can use to build your app. This is what an app, sample app might look like. The Alumni Association is one of our sample apps that we ship in the box. This output is showing you all the formulas that are in the app. Some formulas for some properties, like, I don't know. I think I strip out the ones that are not set. Well, for some of these, there's nothing there. For the ones for which there is a formula, that there's on select, it's doing a navigate, and this is switching between 2 different screens, and using a transition, the fade transition to make that move. Here's another one, if the count if set to a value, then you show if it's plural or not. You can do that kind of thing. Here's a little longer one. It's checking if the current user, by filtering the alumni based on user.email. User.email is something that comes through the system automatically. Then do something, look up now. So this is the kind of logic. It's a whole bunch of small formulas like this that make up the entire app. And this is the way you program Power Apps as opposed to writing long monolithic procedures. Okay, so we keep going. Input and output properties. I want to talk about this quickly just because it does cause some confusion. When I was showing you earlier this dropdown, these are input properties or input-output properties. These are properties for which I can set a value. There's another set of one which are output only. So this text box, is showing the text input one.text, which is what's typed in here. But if I go over here and I try to pull it down and find text, there is no text property because you can't input the text. The text is an output. The text that comes out of here as I type is funneled automatically to this box, this label, and this relationship is enforced here with the text input one.text. And that's how it moves the state from one control to another. Oops. Primitive data types, we have numbers and text, booleans, date times, date. All of them can hold a null value that can be tested with is blank, blank being the term that one would use in Excel. So this should look familiar. There's not integers and big ints and that kind of stuff. Everything's a double like you would expect from Excel world. Text is Unicode text, Boolean self-explanatory, etc. On top of the primitive types, there are compound data types. There are records and tables. A table in Power Apps is a first-class citizen. So you can have a function return a table in its entirety. And that table is a collection of records. We can also define a single column table with just square brackets and a set of values. And that creates a single column table with the heading value. Now this should look familiar from a JSON perspective. It's not exactly JSON because JSON would make you quote the first name and etc. But this looks like an array in JSON. Some of that inspiration comes from the JavaScript world, which is also convenient because we're written in JavaScript, so that helps us. Records and tables can be arbitrarily nested. There are no arrays specifically. They use a table instead. It's at least a single column. Tables are values. They're passed as arguments. They're returned from functions. They're just like a number or a text string. You can just, that complex type is available to you. There's a whole bunch of functions that return a table, like filter and search, sort by columns, shaping. You can add columns and drop columns and do grouping. And I'll show some examples of that in a minute. Now, everything I've said to here has been very Excel-like. It's been about data flow. There has not been any imperative stuff going on. But there are some things that are not like Excel. In particular, Excel doesn't have buttons. You can't put a button on Excel and have it do something in the Excel language proper. Yeah, you can put an ActiveX control and you can have it fire some VBA, but that's outside of Excel. That's outside of what Excel normally is interacting with. Apps require buttons. They require the ability for the user to click on things and cause actions to happen, if nothing else, just to confirm things. Excel also doesn't change state. If you think about it, there's no way in the Excel language proper to go whack a cell with a value. Yeah, you can do it from VBA, but I'm putting that to the side. I'm talking about Excel proper. There's no way to do that inside of Excel, but apps often have to do that. They need to store pieces of state from one place to another. We try to limit that as much as we can, and using the formulas in the dependency graph I've been showing you, you can limit it, but you're eventually going to need some state. And so these two things caused us to extend beyond what Excel normally could do. So there are formulas that define imperative logic. They all start with the on word, so button on select, screen on visible, app on start. These formulas run when the app when an event occurs, and those formulas can use all the regular formula stuff I've been talking about, but they can also run things that have side effects, like pushing data to a database or setting a context variable or any number of other things. And they can be multiple steps. You can use a semicolon to chain them together. Is a double semicolon on some locales because we need to use semicolon because dots and commas change. But in general, for the US market, it is a semicolon. As I said, it does a bunch of work on your behalf. There are variables. So there are global variables that have app-wide scope, and the primary function used there is the set function. There are context variables, which are local to a screen, and in a sense, the screen's context. They can be passed, like passing parameters to a procedure. You can use the navigate call to pass them in, and then and you can update them once you're inside that screen. And then finally, there are collections. These are like global variables, but they're kind of a holdover. We're probably going to deprecate them in favor of global variables in the future. They're app-wide scope. They're only tables, and they have a bunch of functions that interact with them as tables, like being able to update a record and remove a record and add records. They also have the nice ability to save data and load data to the local device. So if you are going to try an offline story, or if you just want to cache some information on the local device, you would load up some information into a collection, you would save data, and then that would be stored on the device for that person, for that app, and only for that scenario. So it's not shared across that user, it's not shared across apps in any way, but it is a nice, convenient place to stuff some stuff if that's what you need. All that good stuff is visible from the backstage. If you go to the File menu in PowerApps, there are collections, variables, media, variables. The global variables here at the top under a global label. These guys are the variables on a particular screen. You can see their current value. If it's a table, you can drill into that table and see what's in there, etc. So all that good information is there. It does provide also the graph of how it gets set. So these are the definition points for when this variable was set. Here are the places where it was used, and here are the indirect places it was used. So all this is available to you. And then collections are very similar. Same kind of idea. They're just a kind of a special case of a global variable. And you can see them out here in the backstage. All right. We're almost to the part where we'll talk about some actual examples, a little more theory first. There's a bunch of app analysis that goes on in this thing as you're writing it. There is a compiler that's running all the time in the background as an incremental compiler. So as I'm typing formulas, it's not only checking out that formula, but it's combining it and integrating that formula into the overall graph of your app. This is a strongly typed system. All types are known based on that at authoring time. Now, you don't have to declare stuff. When you use a global variable or you use a collection, based on how you use it, we will infer the types based on it and ensure that your usage pattern is consistent across the entire app. So you can't use a variable as a number at one point and a string somewhere else. We'll flag that and say, no, don't do that. Dependency cycles could happen. You could have one controls property depend on another controls property, which is dependent on the first controls property. Just like you can in Excel, that would create a dependency cycle. Those are detected and not allowed and flagged and have to be removed. So that's that. So let's see here. So let me give you a demo of some of the stuff I've just been talking about. So I've got a screen here. I have a table control over here that's showing a collection. The collection is defined by this call, this button here, the add to collection. It's creating my collection, and it's setting these properties for saying, priority, and order. And it's reading these values off these text boxes. So saying, if we look at this, it's this purple box, the green box, and the order is just counting rows on my collection. So it effectively is going to be an incrementing counter of which row is which. So as I enter something here in the saying, capitalization, right? And press this button, it will add to the collection, and then the table is just reflecting that collection. So if I select the table, its items property is set to my collection. So it's just inferring, you want to show my collection, all of my collection, and it's showing the three columns that are available there. The columns, there's some, as much as I'm going to talk about formulas today, there's also UI gestures and niceties for interacting with the data stuff in particular. So the table, if I wanted to turn off priority, all I have to do is hit this button, I hope. Wow, that's weird. And that would have gone away. That's weird. I don't know what's going on there. But you have control over the fields that show up in galleries, the fields that show up in data tables and in forms. So let me keep going. You can add that to the collection. Oh, and PowerApps died. That's exciting. Hold on. can I not? There we go. All right. Huh, I wonder what I did. You know, as I was clicking that, oh man. Wow. Okay. Well, I won't do that again. Let's put it that way. There's a brand new build that came out last night. Not good. This, but I'll do that. That doesn't seem to crash. Okay, so I think I made most of the point I wanted to make here around how this works. The other thing I wanted to show, I can show that in a minute in some other way. So let me move on. Let me do a navigate call. So I wanted to show one other thing. The navigate, I'm going to navigate to the previous screen. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to tell it there's no transition, and this is where a context variable comes in. I can set a nav context variable and give it a value. And then what it'll do is it'll set the value. It's not like passing a parameter from one screen to another. It's going to pass this value when I get back to the other screen. And that's what's being displayed in this box down here. It's showing the nav context bar. And so this button doesn't navigate forward. Another way I could have done it, but doesn't pass a context variable, is I could have hit the back button. And that would have taken me back because it keeps a stack of all the screens and where I've been and allows me to go back and forth. Now, you'll notice that the context variable is set here, even though I used the back and I didn't pass it. And that's because it was previously set. The entire app, even, how to put this, you don't call a screen and it only comes into existence right then with those values. No, instead, all the screens are active all the time. The entire app is alive all the time. And I can reference controls and stuff between screens all the time. There's no lifetime associated with the screen in that manner. So I had set it previously, and so unless I change it, this variable is going to stay just like it was. And really, when I do a navigate and back, I'm just changing which screen is currently visible. It doesn't actually change anything else. It's just moving from one to another. So it's a different way of thinking about it. It's not like, it's like Excel, where you have different sheets and you move between the sheets, but the sheets are all of them are always recalculating, even if you don't see it. So that you can reference values between different sheets at any given time. It's exactly the same thing in PowerApps. Okay, let me get into data sources. External sources of tabular data. I've already talked about a bunch of this. I want to go a little faster to get through more of this content. Read-only binding to the gallery, the display form, and the data table. The data table is a basic grid or list control like you would expect to find from Access. It's read-only right now. We are going to make it read-write in the future. We're just not there yet. Read-write binding is done through the edit form control, and then you can read-write using a set of functions as well. You don't have to use these fancy controls. You can instead just totally roll it your own and do it your own way. And people do that because they have a specific need that they need to accomplish. External addresses, I already talked about that, all strongly typed, which means you must refresh when these things change. We have to recompile the app to take into effect that an extra column has been added to a table. That doesn't just automatically happen. So the app needs to be loaded back into Studio, recompiled, and saved back out whenever a data source changes like that. Delegation, Big area. But the idea here is that the filtering and the sorting that PowerApps does, because this is a client technology, we want to move all the data to us to do those operations. There's a huge problem with that. If you have a lot of data, you really don't want to do that, and it can really dramatically reduce performance. So we imposed a kind of arbitrary 500 record limit on all the data that we pull into PowerApps. That's as far as we will go for stuff that has to be handled locally. That doesn't mean we can't handle large volumes of data. I actually did a blog post this morning where we're doing millions of rows of data. But to do that, we have to delegate to the server. We can't, in the Access world, this would be like pulling everything for Jet to handle, as opposed to Jet delegating to SQL Server and saying, okay, you do the aggregate function, you do the join. That's what delegation is, and we're adding more and more delegation every day where we can push these operations to the server, and then we can interact with large volumes of data. So this is a sticky area, and in the meantime, if you're interacting with PowerApps, you'll occasionally see a blue dot, and I'll show you one of those in a second. That blue dot warning means we couldn't delegate it, and the message will essentially say, can you find another way to get this accomplished, which doesn't require a blue dot, which can be delegated. Without that, you're going to be limited to the amount of data that can be processed, and so delegation is the way to go, and we're adding more of that all the time. So let me create a simple app really quickly. I'm going to start off with a gallery. I'm going to create essentially a master detail app like you might see in Access Web Apps. I'm going to create a gallery, and I'm going to connect it to, I've already got 2 tables in here. Sales order is a basic orders table, and sales order line is like order details that you might find in Northwind or an Access database. I'm going to start with the sales order table. I'm going to tell it that I want, ooh, that's tempting. No, I'll stay simple. I've adjusted that. The demo gods are not smiling on me already. Here's a list of orders that came from that table. And I can pick what to show, like order date for the title, or it's probably not the right thing. So let's do, no, sales order ID is fine. Order date, what else we got here? Name. So here's the company that I sold it to. So I can totally configure that these are controls in here. So I can move them around, I can replace them, I can add additional ones. I have total control over how this is like a repeating, a continuous form back in the Access days, a repeating space where I can control how this is, and it just essentially repeats. So I've got that for the list of things, and as I click this button, it will select a different one. Now on the form side, let's put a form down, put an edit form, put that up here in the upper right, connect that to that same data source. This will go and create a very basic outline. I hope, there it goes. This lays out a whole bunch of data cards in this space. Each data card corresponds to a field, and you can insert data cards which are unbound effectively so that you can do whatever you want. The data card, if you click once, you get the data card, and you can move this around. You can unlock it to get to the internals of it. But these controls inside are just like I showed you on the gallery. These you can move around and manipulate and make look any way you want. This is just what comes out of the box. You can change the number of columns. You can add additional fields from that table. It's kind of a wide table, so there's a whole bunch of stuff I could add, but I won't right now. What I want to show you most is wiring this up. So I've got the form control. What is complaining? Okay. Got the form control. There we go. It's going to have its data source property is set to sales order. That largely tells it what data source it's going to be making modifications to. But the one we really want to go after is item. And what we're going to do is we're going to wire this up to the gallery. It's probably 2. Let's see. Yes. Gallery2.selected item, or selected. Hello. I swear it's going to die any second now, it seems. Okay. Now, as I click between the different items here in the gallery, the form will snap to show that item in the form. and it'll allow me to edit the values of that thing. And I won't do it now, but you can put a button control down here to submit changes back to the server for that item. And then the last piece I want to show you is a table of the line items that come from that order. Hello. Again, I connect this to data. Let's make that a little smaller. Okay. Now this is connected to the entire order details table. It's not filtered to a particular order, and that's not what we want. So I'm going to come down to the data table. Right now it's just reflecting everything in the sales order line table. It's not what you want. Instead, I want to filter that. So I'm going to say filter, and I want to say that the sales order ID sales order ID. So this is the sales order ID that's in the line table. This is a foreign key. I want to make that equal to the gallery that's currently being shown. So gallery2.selected sales order ID. Boom. So now it's going to filter this table down to just the stuff for S005, SO005. And as I click around here, the form will change and the table will change to reflect the fact that I changed the selection in the gallery. And so it's all reflecting what's happening in the gallery. There's no imperative logic here. I didn't write an on change event anywhere. It's just all flowing through data flow between these different controls to say where things should go. AFD in the product, not. When you go to PowerApps on the web, I'm going to show you a different entry point. Approve the request. All right, so to make it simple, the first entry point, I started from a place. I can also just say that I want to create an app from the Common Data Service, if that's what I want to do. This will bring up a series of the tables, and I'm just going to pick the account table. And it's going to create me a 3-screen app automatically. And this experience I'm showing you, as I said, is exactly the same as I was showing you a moment ago on the Windows app. It's just in a browser instead. Same output, the same everything. I get this app, and it has 3 screens. It has a browse screen, it has a detail screen, and it has an edit screen. And these are just essentially the same things I was just showing you. I didn't show you the detail screen, but essentially this gallery and the fact that the edit screen, if I hit this edit control and look at its item property, it comes from the gallery selected. It's the same deal. And we allow you to build apps against SharePoint and a whole bunch of other sources in exactly the same manner, where we're reading the schema and building up a basic set of controls that make up a very basic 3-screen app that you can get started with. And we do the same kind of thing for SharePoint and making it really easy to build forms on top of SharePoint. So I'm not going to go into more of this. This just gives more details. I can make this quote deck available to you guys afterward. I'm going to quickly go over this just a few minutes, and then I'll give a few minutes for questions. Patch is another way, the formula way to make changes to a data source. Essentially, you give it the original record. We don't deal with keys so much. We don't make the user understand what a primary key is. Instead, we'd say, just give us the entire record. We'll take that and pull the key information out of it and apply the updates as appropriate. And I keep saying the complete record, or I said the complete record. We don't actually do that under the covers. We're smart about what fields from each data source you actually use, and only do and optimize it so that we only get the projection we get from the data source is only the fields that we actually need, based on what the users use and based on what we need for primary keys. So patch is an important function if you're going to roll your own. If you're doing the 3-screen app from data I just showed you, it doesn't need patch. The form control knows how to write back to databases directly. ForAll, there is iteration. It's not for each. There's a reason we called it ForAll. It's because we can evaluate stuff in parallel. So the order of operations may not be always deterministic. So you got to be a little careful with that. But the output from ForAll, like ForAll evaluates to a table just like everything else. So you take a table, you apply a formula to it, and you get a table out the other end. The formula could have an imperative side effect. It could update a database. It could do any number of things. So you just have to be aware that it's not always going to be in exactly the order that you would expect. Record scope, I won't go in there. It's too detailed. Again, to Excel, there's an example here where, and we need to do a reverse string search. Well, how do you do that? Well, it turns out there's a formula for that in Excel. And it turns out that exact same formula works in PowerApps just as well as it does in Excel. And so there's an example here that shows that, which I won't go into. Single column tables, it's not terribly interesting. Text is like it is in Excel. Launch and param, so there's a way to launch other apps as well as launch web pages, and you can pass parameter to other apps. So you can have one app call another, and if you're all on the rich client, it'll do the right thing and not have to go out. It'll launch it in place, replacing the original app. Image handling, I'm sure my camera's on. There I am. Images are just URLs, and the camera control here, I can click the button to snap a picture. It makes a copy. That becomes a blob internally, like a data colon. And from there, you can push this blob to a data source, and the right thing happens to make it push the value up to the data store. And a couple other things. So with that, I'm going to stop. I'm going to go look at the list of questions. And if people want to just voice questions, that's fine too. I did not make the proper sacrifices. You're absolutely correct. We're shooting the moon. Formatting, indenting, pretty printing a little for the formulas. The formulas pretty print a little bit. You can pull this down. You can also format this any way you really want, in the sense that it can be multi-line, just like you can in Excel. It's not the prettiest thing in the world to do, but you can make it multi-line. You can stretch this thing out even further if you want. But beyond that, the color coding and that's as much as we have right now. Somebody asked about generating the list of the similar list I had of the alumni app. I actually made that. I do have a tool for doing that. It's currently written in Perl that just reads out art. Another thing that you should be aware of, you can save file, you can save apps. You can save it to the cloud, and that's primarily where things go and where things are shared. But you can also save it to your computer, and you can just save it as a file, and it goes out as a .ms app file. That file you can manage any way you want, and that's the internal to that file is just a zip file, is like everything else we do at Microsoft. And so you can open up the zip file, and you can see all the JSON artifacts that make up your app, including all the formulas. And that tool I have, that's all it does, is it just opens that file and spelunks through it and does a cursory job of doing color coding. Yeah, no, the point about the readability of the code versus debugging, it's a fair point. If you have a really complex app, we do see these formulas that are ridiculously complex. We do think we need some kind of pre-printing like I showed you that makes that easier. But the intent is that we're trying to keep those formulas to one-liners so that they're really easy to understand, and it's really easy to find them. You can see, all you have to do is find the effect that you're trying to isolate. The fact that this thing's color changed, well, just go to the thing and see what's driving it, what's reduced from it, without having to worry about all the different places that could have touched it. Instead, it'll all be listed right there. So that pull model, we do think is easier to work with. But debugging in general, logging at least of what's going on with respect to data sources is something we need to work on and do a better job with. Other questions? Who's the target audience? It is a wide spectrum, actually. We are trying to address with this technology both, we call them Barb is our persona for a low-end user who would be using InfoPath on top of SharePoint, because PowerApps is not meant to just replace Access, but also replace InfoPath as well. And so you'll see us doing a lot right now to make it super easy to create a form on top of a SharePoint list and do customizations of that. It's not relational. It has very simple data semantics. Very little business logic, but you can define little rules like you could in InfoPath that are very point and click, like here's a validation rule and here's a move from screen to screen rule. That kind of stuff we'll definitely do for sure. But there's a wider spectrum. A lot of the success we've seen in enterprise deployments have been more, we call Ivans and Davids. We have a whole list of personas that have been defined. Ivans and Davids are more of an IT administrator, or a David is more of a professional developer. Who is using this technology to build stuff quickly, more of a rapid application development thing. And so that's there's more there and more headroom. And we do want, what's nice about this as opposed to Excel is that Excel kind of had this huge cliff between Excel and VBA. We're trying to make that a smooth transition. If you want to add some imperative logic, if you want to call a REST API, you don't have to exit quote Excel. You can use the same language, the same formulas you've been using to do the simple stuff, all the way up to the more complicated stuff directly within the tool. So that we're hoping there's a wider spectrum than we've seen in other products. How about documentation? Documentation for what, George? For the product? There's documentation for the product and for the blog. Yeah, that's all there. Go back over here. PowerApps.com. There's the learn, there's all the documentation, and then there's the blog. I added this morning, we just started doing delegation for some and other aggregates on SQL Server. But all the documentation is here. The reference is my baby, so you'll see I've written most of the stuff down here about the understanding topics, and the formula reference on the different functions is all available here. But the stuff up here is good for getting started and how to do customization, running existing app, etc. There's also a set of guided learning, which is here, which is a set of videos about how to get going, which are targeted. They're just a few minutes a piece that talk about different pieces of the thing. These are great as well. So this is a good way to get started and learn more about it. Yeah, who would have thought? Learn. Yep. It's all here. And there's a rich community. There's a ton of people out here trying different things, pushing us. There's 21,000 posts in our forum. This is where we get our, what's the word? The idea forum. There's another word for that. But the place where people can put their ideas and vote on the ideas and help us decide what stuff we should go after next. That's all here too. Other questions?
Greg.
Yeah.
Quick questions. I know PowerApp is more towards the mobile applications. Am I right? Can we create a desktop version of an application?
Yeah. So people do build web-based stuff today, but you're right. If you look at when you create something new, or I don't have to do that. I can just look at app settings. The screen size and orientation, there's a set of I've been using tablet layouts primarily, I've been showing you guys, and there's landscape portrait in different sizes. There's also mobile phones. Definitely this started as a mobile first product, and we're expanding it to do more web stuff. And when you see people doing the web, they're usually doing this tablet view, and using smaller sizes on fonts and stuff within the screen. But it's a good point. The screen itself, it just scales. It's not responsive. It doesn't try to fill, in the sense that the screen itself doesn't get larger. The screen, when you're doing WYSIWYG out here, it's gonna look like this. And as I run on different devices, it will scale this with blackboxing, letterboxing to show where things are where it doesn't fit. Being able to create stuff that's responsive and can adapt based on the screen size is something we are working on doing, but it's hard, especially in this world where this PowerPoint metaphor of having essentially slides and putting things exactly where they are. PowerPoint isn't responsive either. It's what you see is what you get exactly, and that's nice and not so nice. It's great for somebody who's getting started and they want to just whack something together and they don't have to worry about those concepts of being responsive. But for more professional solutions, you're going to want something that's more responsive. And so that's an area we're actively working on. But I don't think you're going to see a lot of movement on that in the near term. We are more focused on ease of use for SharePoint and enabling data scenarios through CDS and other data providers for people that are coming from the Access world. They're looking for more of a relational database backend.
So Greg, with that, do you think that people should create like one app for the tablet mode and one app for the phone? And then secondly, if I want to, if you go under File and you look at the horizontal versus vertical, I can choose one of those. And even if I say that the app can change from one to the other, it doesn't seem that I can figure out a way to test it automatically.
Yeah, there's no way to test automatically. You kind of have to deploy it and save it at least, and then open it up on a mobile device to see it in that world. And these don't do a ton. They help small amounts, but there are limits to how far we'll take them. And so that's why you don't see a ton happening with those guys. So these are just back to its Sienna roots of being primarily a mobile first product, and only later do we try to extend it to the web and these more business-oriented applications, and we're just not there yet. Taking a tablet and you can squint and see it, but we have developers with huge screens that have tiny fonts, and you take one of our apps and throw it on there, it just looks ginormous because nothing scaled down. It didn't take advantage of the fact that that person's DPI is set really high and they want it that way. They want to see a lot of information. We're not in a place where we can automatically do that for that user. We'll get there, but just not today.
Okay, so for today, if I know that my customer is using both tablets and phones, do I need to create two different apps then?
If you really want a great experience for both, yes.
Okay.
Correct. Some people just live with the fact that this phone will show up looking big on a tablet or the web and in portrait mode. But the enterprise deployments, primarily we've seen people that do both if they really care about a great experience on both. And then in some cases, people just like, okay, well, I'm going to build it primarily for one, and the other one's not going to be so good, but it's still usable, and they'll just go with that because they don't care as much about that second form factor.
Greg, sorry, can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Even though there are no joins and not relational aware, you ever have apps where you would have more than one, where you would be linked to more than one SharePoint list, for example?
Yeah, so the example I showed, that's kind of how you do multi-table stuff that's related, is you have to do your own filtering. You also have to use add columns with lookup to go, and we see that a lot. Somebody will take a base table and they'll have a foreign key and they'll use it to go grab information from another table. And the way they do that is they'll use add columns to add a column to the first table that's a lookup into the second table. It's all manual. It's not very efficient. It's not where we want to be long term. I can't talk about it yet, but I'm hoping at the Ignite timeframe we'll have a lot better story for this, for relationships, and then we'll move forward with that. I think you guys will be very happy with that. But right now it's kind of piecemeal, but it's completely doable. It's just not the best experience.
Thanks.
Let's see, George. So, what's the prospects? It's so hard to tell. I can say this: a tremendous amount of investments going on in PowerApps. The team is huge, so much bigger than any Access team I've ever seen. So much bigger in some ways than the SharePoint team. It's a huge effort, and you're seeing it in inroads in Office, in Dynamics, in lots of places. So certainly, it's impossible to predict where we'll be in 10 years, but all indicate right now the investment is solidly here and only here. There is no other competing stuff going on within Microsoft, and we're just anything that would even close to compete. We're pulling them together, and we're making the best effort we can to put all the wood behind the PowerApps arrow. So I'm bullish on it, but 10 years is an eternity in the technology business. We'll see. It is interesting to this is not my first rodeo with respect to these concepts. It is interesting to see how things evolve, how concepts from VB became Access, became other web tools, and then now our PowerApps. It's all very similar stuff, just with different angles and different priorities around mobile, around cloud versus what we've done in the past. And so that's gratifying that the same kind of stuff that we've always done before is either here or coming here soon. And so I am very bullish on what's going on here. Dynamic scaling is absolutely a priority. It's a lower priority. It's amazing how far you can go with the fixed scaling. It is for professional developers that are accustomed to responsive frameworks, it does feel really limiting, but definitely for people coming from InfoPath, they don't even bat an eye. They're just like, oh, I don't care. It works. And it's amazing how far you can get with just the fixed scaling. So it is definitely coming, but it's going to take us a little time to get there, especially since the model really isn't conducive to it as it currently is done. It's going to require the author to be aware, and the previewing stuff we talked about. We've talked about previewing directly on the device. So you hit the preview button, and instead of seeing it in the screen, it can deploy to the device directly, and you can see it there. Things like that. We're playing through those concepts. I think it'll happen within the next year. When I say a long time, a year is about as far out as we're currently thinking. So it'll come. It's just going to take some time. Business logic and CDS also coming. We may have some things to talk about at Ignite with respect to that. But they are definitely thinking about it. They are learning from what's going on in CRM. They're learning from what happened in Access Web Apps. Tons of discussions, tons of activity. From my perspective, they're thinking about it the right way. They're thinking about transactions being baked in, making it really easy to do, trigger-oriented as well as being able to call methods. So I'm bullish there as well. Beyond business logic on CDS, we on the PowerApps team need to do a better job of making SQL logic easier to use. Right now, if you have a table with triggers, we can't even consume those in PowerApps because of the way SQL works. And if you have a trigger, it doesn't allow us to get the output from an operation and blah, blah, blah. It's all technical stuff that we need to work through to make sure that we can do a great job with SQL as well, because ultimately that's the place where a professional developer may want their stuff, where they have the most control over what's going on.
Hey, Greg.
Yep.
I know you guys been saying that this PowerApp can replace Access Web.
Yeah.
But this one seems like Access Web is like you can create full-blown web application with the Access Web, but seems like you on this PowerApp has very limitation that you cannot do a lot of things that what we can do with the Access Web.
Well, the biggest thing you can't do that you can do in Access Web Apps is the business logic. That's our biggest hole. Most of the rest of it you can do, or you can do better in PowerApps. The Access Web Apps weren't responsive either. They were a fixed size. They could take advantage of more screen real estate, but only in a very specific manner. So that's not a whole lot better in an Access Web App. The apps that I've been showing you, they run directly on the web just as well as anywhere else. And you can directly URL to them, and so there's a lot. There's not a lot missing from Access Web Apps to PowerApps today, except for one key element, which is business logic. And so that's the biggest hole we currently have. Another hole, I guess, would be around the joins. But as I say, there's ways to get around that, to do it manually. It's not as performant as you would get from doing it through SQL. So the query engine The query formula stuff that we have is not as strong as you would have with an Access web app, but it's not. For a lot of situations, it's okay. It'll get you by. But definitely the business logic is the biggest thing that we're currently missing. Security credentialing, everything's done through Azure AAD, Azure Active Directory. Currently, the apps can only be used by people in the same tenant. So you can't do B2B or B2C scenarios at the moment. There's no anonymous access. That's another gap with respect to Access web apps, because you could do some of that there. But that's how security is managed, is through AAD. So you have a subscription either through Office 365 or Dynamics 365, and that allows you to get access to PowerApps. Or I think you can buy it separately. There's a whole bunch of licensing models. I'm not even aware of all of them. They keep changing.
Greg, I know sometimes you talk a little bit about Desktop Studio, and other times, the web version of PowerApps. Are there any pros and cons versus using one over the other?
No, you'll find most of the team uses Chrome, because the JavaScript engine here is the fastest. In the Windows version, it's a Windows 8 app, Metro app, and it uses the old IE7 JavaScript engine, and so it's considerably slower than Chrome. So people largely on the team just will use Chrome and use it on the web. I started in the desktop app because I was doing this. I wanted to do this presentation, and this I could run offline. So this app that I've been playing with here, showing you guys, I didn't need anything. So from that perspective, I could be on a plane doing this thing. I couldn't connect to data per se, but I could do everything else in here. So there's that advantage is a little bit more local than being based on the web. But otherwise, the only real big difference between these two right now is that I can't get to all the sensors from the web environment. I can't get to the accelerometers, for example, because they're not exposed through HTML. Now, most people don't deal with accelerometers all the time. I have run into a company that did. I was actually surprised. I didn't know if they would ever be used for anything more than games playing around with our team, but I had one company that was building an app that was with rental cars, and they wanted to detect something about how fast they had gone or something. It was crazy, but it was like, yeah, somebody actually used the accelerometers. But that doesn't work on the web, and there's a couple other device limitations that don't work on the web. But other than that, this largely, it is the same code base, so you will get the same experience between the web version and the local version. And literally 80% of our usage is on the web. So I don't know, at some point we may drop the Windows Studio and just go with the Web Studio. We'd still, of course, let you run apps on Windows locally, but actually authoring, maybe the web is where people want to be instead. And it's not just the JavaScript thing. There is a C# compiler in the background that's running for both of them, and in the cloud version, that can be running on our hardware on beefy servers. Not that my machine is slow here, but we've actually seen better performance from that service as opposed to trying to do it locally. All right, anything else?
Well, Greg, this has been great. I know you've opened my eyes to a lot of things, especially, I've always been thinking about, why are they using the Excel-like formulas when, all the rest of us are into VBA, and then you've got people like George and Julian and I that have, created pretty extensive Access web apps, and, we had to switch to the whole macro world. But
Yep.
Understanding it from the standpoint of the one thing that you said that really caught my eye is that you don't have to have a form loaded in order to grab information out of it. It's kind of like having a bunch of sheets within an Excel workbook where
Yep.
it's all available, so you can just reference that, as opposed to in Access web apps, setting a variable that you can pass to another form that loads, or VBA within Access Desktop. So I thought that was very interesting.
Good. I'm glad. Glad it was helpful. And you guys, most of you guys know me, and I'll leave my contact information. You guys feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer questions anytime about this stuff and help ease the transition of people moving to this new platform.
Yeah, that's great. And if you can share the slide deck with me, I can make sure that it gets posted on the PowerApps user group site.
Yeah, I'd happy to do that.
That'd be great.
Greg,
right.
can you give us your contact information?
Yes, I will do that. My email is just gregli@microsoft.com, but I will make that. I'll put that in the deck for you guys to reach out. Happy to do it anytime. Yes,
Yeah,
Doug. Yes, I know what I'm signing up for.
I'm here. If you can just text that on the Skype, that would be great. Thank you.
I'll put the slide. I'll put the window right now as well. Great. I'm glad to hear that, Julian. Okay, everybody. Thank you very much. And we'll talk soon, I'm sure.